Surrender always has a price. Commitment comes.
So we have arrived at the point where we're going to dissect the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? And we've talked about where the track of truth lies close behind the track of error, and this is a quote from Ellen White. And also we've talked about where in Hebrews the writer says that maturity belongs to those who are able to discern between good and evil, who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And then again we ask the question, why is it so hard to discern good and evil? It's not unless you realize that there are two trees here, and one of them is life, and the other one is a mixture of good and evil. Okay, so this good from this tree here has been what we think of good, but good really belongs to this tree. Do you see what I'm saying?
See, it's not God's goodness.
Okay, that's why we've been so deceived. We've been caught into this cycle of good and evil of Satan, and we think that this is what good is, but good belongs to the tree of life, not to the good of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Because that good that is in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is what we would do for selfish reasons, for reward, for getting prominence, coming to be exalted, and all of that.
Wrong motivation.
Exactly.
There's an agenda to it.
Yes. Because if Satan's system was purely evil, nobody would be following it. Nobody. He had to have his system of good in it. And that's why the whole world has followed Satan's system of good and evil.
So, what did Paul mean by the words discerning both good and evil? How do we discern them? Was he talking about the good and the evil of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? If so, we can run into problems, because the tree of life is good because it's life. And no one can dispute that. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil has to be evil because it causes death. Okay? It is poison. And God said so. And yet, this tree has good in it too, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil causes death, then the good of this tree has to be a component of that poison. As such, it cannot be good, okay? So, the answer then to what Paul said, that we need to know the distinction between good and evil, is simple then. The tree of life is good. And Jesus had said, there is no one good but God, remember? In Matthew 19:17. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is evil, because God had said, the day you eat of it, you will surely die. So, Jesus' warning that we read earlier about false prophets can help us understand this as well. He said, every good tree bears good fruit, tree of life. Every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Okay? Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know. You will know them. And this is from Matthew 7:17-20. So a tree that causes death is a bad tree. Therefore, it cannot bear good fruit, in spite of its appearances. So remember the false prophets. They came in sheep's clothing, but were really ravening wolves. Okay? They had a mixture of good and evil. And the scribes and Pharisees, they had a beautiful facade, but inside they were full of death. Jesus said that they appeared beautiful outwardly, but inside were full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness, which is the mixture of good and evil. So Lucifer's proposed changes to the law of God could not have been good, but by the sheer fact that they deviated from the perfect law of life, and as a result caused death. Ellen White says, since the law of the Lord is perfect, every variation from it must be evil. Those who disobey the commandments of God and teach others to do so are condemned by Christ. The Savior's life of obedience maintained the claims of the law and showed the excellence of character that obedience would develop. All those who obey as he did are likewise declaring that the law is holy and just and good.
Is that all her quote?
That's all her quote from Signs of the Times, March 29, 1910, paragraph 11. Signs of the Times,
ST, March 29,
29,
1910, para 11.
March 29, 1910. So,
Satan's law is a variation of God's law. Thus it is evil. His law cannot have any true good in it.
Amen.
Spiritual maturity, therefore, is being able to discern between these two trees. One is life, good. The other is death, evil. Here is the problem. We have been trapped inside the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have looked at its good thinking,
at its good,
thinking that it is good, it is of God.
Right.
We have looked at its good, thinking that it is of God. We must think outside of this tree in order to see what true good is. We must look to the tree of life. Then we will be able to discern both good and evil. And the only person that can show us the tree of life is Jesus Christ.
Okay, and we have looked at that quote from Ellen White from Education, page 190, paragraph 2, in which she says that there are two principles running for supremacy. Do you remember that? And she says how we should understand the nature of these two principles that are contending for supremacy, and should learn to trace their working through the records of history and prophecy to the great consummation. And we should see how in this controversy enters into every phase of human experience, how in every act of life we revealed the one or the other of the two antagonistic motives, okay? And how, whether we will or not, we are even now deciding upon which side of the controversy we will be found. So these two principles affect us directly in our lives, in every act of life, okay? So spiritual maturity is being able to discern these two principles so that we can either be found in the tree of life or in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And of course this is easier said than done, because this is our nature, and also we've been deceived by this, okay? We know that in the garden we became so attuned to this tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God had to put enmity between us and the tree and Satan. He said, and I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And there he shows us who was going to put the enmity. Jesus was going to tell us, the seed was going to tell us the truth, so that we would be able to separate from that tree. And so why would God have to put enmity between the serpent and the woman? The answer can only be because there was complete sympathy between the woman and the serpent at that point. Okay, from the moment that she ate of the tree. Enmity would come through the seed, who was Jesus Christ. And the seed would bruise the serpent's head. Okay? So unless we look to Jesus as the true model of righteousness, of goodness, we cannot see the deceptive nature of Satan's law. In fact, what we often believe to be truth in terms of human morality, turns out to be false and part of the rebel's law. For this reason, many of us cannot accept the real truth when it's given to us. And sadly, some of us turn away from the true God. Okay. So since Lucifer has so deceived us to the point that we are in agreement with him, we must be able to first see his deceptions before we can reject them. Our hearts must be melted by the love of God, and we must daily commune with him to be able to discern. And we will begin, okay, so here, this is a crucial point, okay? We're going to begin to understand good and evil when we realize the foundational reason for Lucifer's rebellion against the law of God. And we already know that Lucifer considered God's law weak and foolish, but why did he think that, okay? So I want you to consider the following words from Desire of Ages, page 761, paragraph 4.
In the opening of the great controversy, Satan had declared that the law of God could not be obeyed, that justice was inconsistent with mercy, and that should the law be broken, it would be impossible for the sinner to be pardoned. Every sin must meet its punishment, urged Satan. And if God should remit the punishment of sin, he would not be a God of truth and justice. When man broke the law of God and defiled his will, Satan exulted. It was proved, he declared, that the law could not be obeyed, man could not be forgiven, because he, after his rebellion, had been banished from heaven. Satan claimed that the human race must be forever shut out from God's favor. God could not be just, he urged, and yet show mercy to sinners. So I want to read this last sentence again. God could not be just, he urged, and yet show mercy to the sinner. Can you imagine? That God cannot be just, which means to say God must, to be just, must punish sinners.
Okay, and I want to emphasize that she says in the opening of the great controversy, okay, and this takes us back to Ezekiel 28, that verse that we saw, that Lucifer was perfect in his ways until iniquity was found in him. That's the opening.
He was perfect. He was perfect in his ways from the day he was created till iniquity was found in him.
And that is the opening of the great controversy. Okay, so both this quote from Ellen White and "You were perfect in your ways," that passage, are referring to the beginning of Satan's rebellion. Okay, so this is inception. It's the inception of this whole thing. Now, if we put these passages together, we see that the iniquity that was found in Lucifer was the opening of the great controversy, and that it was a new concept of justice. And let me read the passage again from Ellen White. In the opening of the great controversy, Satan had declared that the law of God could not be obeyed, and listen to this, that justice was inconsistent with mercy. That was his opinion. Okay? He was saying to God, justice cannot be consistent with mercy. And that should the law be broken, it would be impossible to pardon the sinner. This is Lucifer's idea, coming from his iniquity. And then look what he says. Every sin must meet its punishment, urged Satan.
Can you imagine?
This was not God speaking. This is Satan. Every sin must meet its punishment, urged Satan. And if God should remit, remember what the word remit means? Pardon. If God should pardon or take away the punishment of sin, then God would not be a God of truth and justice. You see how he's turning things upside down? God's justice is mercy. And he's saying, that justice cannot be consistent with mercy. Okay? This is how he entered into controversy with God. So, isn't this a description of our moral makeup? That justice involves punishment? Right? When we hear of crimes in the news, don't we believe that the perpetrators must be punished accordingly in proportion to their crime? We even have some expressions that describe this sentiment, like they had it coming to them, or they deserve every bit of it. Right? And that is our moral makeup from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Lucifer's announcement that justice is inconsistent with mercy reveals a new way of thinking about justice. His way, but not God's way. Mercy is God's justice. According to the Bible, this is the foundation of his throne. The passage in Isaiah we mentioned earlier says, the throne shall be established. In mercy, oh here it is, in mercy the throne will be established. And one will sit on it in truth, that's Jesus Christ, in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and hastening righteousness.
What reference is that?
This is Isaiah 16:5.
Thank you.
Okay, and we know again from the tabernacle that the law was covered by the mercy seat. These are all symbols indicating to us to understand these concepts. And the covering cherubs were hovering over that mercy seat.
And that mercy seat represents Jesus Christ.
Yes, and it represents God's kingdom of mercy, his law of mercy, the foundation of his law. In Psalm 89:14 it says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Mercy and truth go before your face.
Could you repeat the reference again, my mind?
Yes, Psalm 89:14.
Thank you.
And Psalm 25:10, another one. All the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth, to such as keep his covenant and his testimonies, to such as believe in him, right? Psalm 32:10. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, mercy shall surround him. Psalm 86:15. But you, O Lord, are a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in mercy and truth. Psalm 89:2. For I have said, mercy shall be built up forever. Your faithfulness you shall establish in the very heavens. So, Lucifer was claiming that the flaw, the weak point in God's law of love, was its lack of arbitrary punishment. He argued that agape love was doomed for failure without punishment. It was weak, inefficient, and foolish. Ironically, it was precisely because there was no inherent punishment in God's law that Lucifer himself had the freedom to bring in his way, his law, without having to fear punishment and destruction from God.
Mm-hmm.
But Satan's law is not just about punishment. If this were the case, it's highly doubtful that he would have managed to draw 1/3 of the angels to his side, because punishment is cruel. It involves cruelty. The symbol that helps us understand his moral law, again, is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it was not just called the tree of evil, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, two opposites. This is a subtle but extremely significant nuance, because it is through this mingling, this mixture of good and evil, that Satan has managed to deceive us. To claim that there is any good in the devil might look like blasphemy to some people, though. Okay, the natural human mind cannot conceive of such a thing, and rightly so. But Lucifer's law does have a side that appears to be good. Okay. We all know what he stands for. He is the devil, after all. He's pure evil. It seems absurd to propose that any form of good, even arbitrary, could come from him, right? One assumes that everything about him is wickedness, and ultimately this is true. So how do we understand this good? Is it good or is it evil? When God said to Adam, of every tree you shall eat, but don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because the day you eat of it, you will surely die. God was declaring that both the good and the evil of Satan's system embedded in this tree were a part of a death principle. Thus, this good is a false good because, along with its evil counterpart, it causes death. There is no true goodness here, even though Satan would like to think us that is so. Okay. And ultimately, the good of good and evil is evil because it's entirely opposed to God's principle of the tree of life. And that's the foundation.
Can you just repeat that last sentence?
Yes. Ultimately, the good of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is entirely opposed to the tree of life principle. And that's why it is evil. And that's foundational. And there's one more thing. Even though Lucifer's morality is comprised of what appears to be two principles, good and evil, in reality they're just one principle. It's a single coalesced corrupt principle. Think of a coin. And the ancient philosophers expressed this through the word dyad. Okay? A coin is one thing, but it has two sides. Okay? They also referred to God's principle as a monad, number one. Dyad, number two. Monad, tree of life, number one. A dyad is always a duality of opposing concepts. So you have light and darkness. You have good and evil. You have yin and yang. Okay?
But in reality, they are not really opposing concepts.
Yeah.
Keep that in
They
mind.
appear to be. Okay. Okay. So good and evil is dualistic, and that's number two. It's telltale. Whenever you see this number two dualistic thing, just like we mentioned the cross, you have good and you have evil. The dualistic. That's the cross is the symbol for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it has been from ancient times, from all the ancient religions. Okay. So the good of the principle of good and evil is a kind of love. But this love is completely different from agape love. And ultimately, this is why this good is not good. Okay? Lucifer fastens on to the concept of beneficence because God is beneficent. So Lucifer took that. And in this way, he was drawing from the life, from the truth of God. Okay? But this love is more like a bribe system, and we've talked about it. It's a system of rewards. Okay? Now, the other side of his coin, punishment, is his justice. And I mentioned how the ancient gods came like husband and wife. One representing beneficence, the other representing punishment. And you have Isis and Osiris. Isis is the wife of Osiris, and she represents justice, and Osiris represents beneficence. Okay? And so the punishment is the evil side of the coin. Reward and punishment are the primary distinguishing features of this law. Okay. And so the knowledge of good and evil uses arbitrary rewards and punishments as motivations, as incentives. And this is Lucifer's wisdom. This is the core of his wisdom. That we can be motivated more for a reward than by love. Right? If I give you $10,000 to be nice to your neighbor, You probably do it. If I ask you to be nice to your neighbor just out of love, unless you have that love, you won't do it, right? Unless you have agape love. But if I gave you 10,000, I'm sure that most people would do it, right? So, positive and negative incentives. And the goal of it all was to produce order. And that again seems out of character for Satan, because we just think of him as being evil all the time. But what he wanted to do was to create order.
It's interesting that the positive plus negative equals 0.
Yes.
So it goes back to nothing,
Goes back to nothing.
to that.
That's
Yes.
very
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes, that's it. So,
Wow, that's good.
so the incentive was to produce order and to promote good behavior. And now we can see how we can enter the system of works here. Okay, it's like the good cop, bad cop. One is being good to you, and then the bad cop comes and he does his thing. But they both have one purpose, right? To get things out of you. Well, the good cop and the bad cop in Lucifer's system is, they both have the same common goal, which is to produce order. Because remember, Lucifer was competing with God for a universal order, a new world universal order. So his ideas were highly organized and systematic. It wasn't just some shabby, weak claims such as lawlessness or pride. It had much more to do to it. And his principle appeared even logical to the angels. And it appears logical to many of us still. Okay? Now, both reward and punishment are external motivators. Can you see that? They're imposed on you. It doesn't come from within your heart. It comes from someone else imposing it on you. And that is where violence comes in, all right? And that's where our freedom of conscience is also removed if we fall prey to it. And they also damage our relationships. And they create selfishness, fear, pride, and alienation. And they especially damage our relationship with God, because this law has made us believe that it's God who arbitrarily punishes and rewards us. Go ahead. Okay, this causes us to be afraid of God, and as a result we run away from Him, who is the only source of love, joy, and life. In essence, reward and punishment is nothing more than Pavlovian conditioning. You know, Pavlov, the Russian psychologist, entered into this experiment that if he would reward the dogs would have a certain conditioned response, and if he would punish the dogs, the same thing, you know. So Satan created the Pavlovian system, and this dehumanizes us and removes our true identity as sons and daughters of God.